Good evening and welcome to the second presentation in the City of Fullerton's Housing Game Plan Speakers Series, The Economics of Housing Development. My name is Julie Cooper, Vice President with Economic and Planning Systems. This presentation was prepared in collaboration with Jason Moody, Managing Principal at Economic and Planning Systems, and Lance Harris, Partner at Proforma Advisors. As land use economic consultants, our firms provide market and economic analysis to support planning efforts and inform how public land use policies can positively impact the feasibility of developing new housing. In this presentation, we will review some basic economic principles of the housing market, discuss how trends in the housing market are impacting households, and introduce ways that the city can help. Let's start with an introduction to the different types of costs that go into the development of housing. First, there is the cost to buy the property. This is often referred to as raw land, whether or not the property is currently developed. In addition to the actual land cost, there is often a price paid by the developer to the seller to hold the property for them and not sell it to another buyer, while they go through all or part of the city approval process. Next, there is the cost associated with the city approval process. This includes all the application and associated project review and impact fees. The amount of city fees will vary depending on the scope of the project and if the project also needs an environmental analysis under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. Once a project is approved, any existing improvements are removed and the site is prepared for new construction. This could include adding necessary infrastructure such as water, sewer, and storm drain connections, and undergrounding utilities. Once the site is ready, construction can begin. This is often referred to as the vertical phase of the development, when the project begins to come out of the ground. As with infrastructure and site preparation, the construction phase includes both labor and material costs for everything from the walls to the kitchen sink to final finishes and landscaping. Administration is a broad term to cover a number of costs that occur at various phases throughout the project. These costs are often referred to as soft costs. This category includes costs to prepare the technical plans and reports required to get construction permits and to provide information to all of the construction trades building the project. Marketing costs for a project to attract buyers to new housing are also included in this category. The last cost to talk about is the cost of capital. Developers typically borrow money to finance all the costs we just reviewed. There are a number of ways this can occur, and development deals often use a combination of many financing options. Regardless of what financing strategy is used, there is a cost to use what is essentially someone else's money for a period of time. This is referred to as the cost of capital. The cost can vary based on the length of time the money is borrowed, as well as the risk associated with the deal. The longer the money is borrowed for, or the higher the risk, the higher the cost of capital. Now that we have a better understanding of the different types of costs that go into the development of housing, let's talk about the impact of these costs on housing supply. Over time, the costs associated with real estate development have increased. There are fewer properties that are easy to develop, regulations have increased, wages have increased, and material costs have increased. This has led to what is shown on the screen. The chart shows that in Fullerton, the overwhelming majority of the housing stock was built before 1979. In each subsequent decade, less than 10% of the existing housing stock was built. The limited housing supply causes competition for the units, which pushes housing prices higher. The median home price increased 41% since 2010, and the median rent has also increased by 34%. Importantly, however, the median income has not increased at the same pace. For the same time period from 2010 to 2018, Fullerton's median income only increased by 9%. We are going to look at the impact of this in two ways: housing affordability and housing cost burden. More than half of Fullerton's households, 55%, earn 80% of the area median income for Orange County or less. Another 17% make between 80% and 120% of median income. In Speaker Series number 1, we learned that a moderate income household could, without overspending for housing, afford a $500,000 home price. This means that Fullerton's median home price of $660,000 is out of reach for more than 75% of Fullerton's households. In other words, about 75% of the city's households would likely not be able to afford a house if they were seeking to purchase in today's market. So who are these Fullerton households that can't afford a median-priced Fullerton home? When talking about median income in the context of housing, we add a level of specificity in terms of the number of people in the household. The larger the household, the higher the income can be within the income category because the income is supporting more people. A one-person household in the moderate income category earns between approximately $72,000 and $87,000. This includes a nurse at St. Jude Medical Center, an assistant professor at Cal State Fullerton, a software engineer at Raytheon, or a teacher with experience at Fullerton school districts. A one-person household in the low-income category earns up to roughly $72,000. This includes an administrative analyst at Cal State Fullerton, faculty at Fullerton College, and teachers at Fullerton school districts. A two-person household would need to have at least two moderate income earners to reach the above moderate income category, where the purchase of a median-priced home begins to become feasible. Importantly, what this data shows is that a person can get a job at any one of Fullerton's top 6 employers and be unable to afford a median-priced home in the city. As an example, less than 14% of St. Jude Medical Center employees live in the city, with only 60% residing in Orange County. This exemplifies what happens when there is not sufficient housing at price points people can afford. People often have no choice but to live where housing is less expensive in exchange for a longer commute. Workers may also opt to live in overcrowded conditions to be able to afford housing. Lastly, households may decide to spend a disproportionate amount of their income on their housing. This is referred to as housing cost burden, which we will discuss in the next slide. Cost burdened in the context of housing refers to when a household spends more than 30% of its income on rent. Tenure refers to whether a household rents or owns its housing. The chart on the screen shows that over 58% of renters and almost 33% of owners in Fullerton are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Why is cost burden important? Housing is just one of many expenses a household has on a monthly basis. If the household has to spend a disproportionate amount of their income on housing, they will have less to spend on transportation, food, child care and other necessities, or savings for retirement or emergencies, and other discretionary expenses. St. Jude Medical Center has provided 2 such examples from members of its staff. A registered nurse who is a single mom with 2 children spends 38% of her income on housing, while 2 housekeepers who are married to each other spend 50% of their income on housing. The higher the housing cost burden, the more drastic the trade-off is, as less income is available to cover other expenses. So how do we fix this? There are 2 ways the city can help increase the supply of housing, which can expand housing options at a variety of price points that do not currently exist. The first is to facilitate market-based housing production, and the second is to support financially assisted housing production. Let's talk more about both. How can the city help facilitate market-based housing production? At the beginning of the presentation, we learned about the costs associated with land development. It is true that these are costs paid by a developer, but the city can influence certain costs in all 6 categories. With respect to raw land, we talked about the fact that there is often a price paid by the developer to the seller to hold the property for them and not sell it to another buyer while they go through the city approval process. The faster the project can proceed through city review, the less the developer needs to pay for this option. With respect to city approvals, land use tools exist which can simplify and streamline the review. These are talked about in more detail in Speaker Series number 3. Infrastructure installation and site preparation is often heavily influenced by city regulations and conditions of approval with respect to upgrades needed for the proposed development. While legitimate costs cannot necessarily be reduced, it is important that the developer's responsibility for these improvements be identified early in the city review process and remain unchanged, so that it can be structured into the purchase price and financing of the project. City regulations, particularly in the area of unit size, density, open space, and parking, can indirectly influence construction costs. More flexible development standards can allow for more variety of housing types. With respect to the technical plans and reports preparation component of administration costs, the bulk of the cost and responsibility certainly lies with the quality of the professionals tasked with preparing the documents. The city can play a role here to make sure that the requirements are stated in advance and the city review process is clear, complete, and timely. Lastly, we discussed that the longer the money is borrowed for, or the higher the risk, the more it costs a developer to use that money. The length of time and the risk associated with the financing both increase with the number of city approvals needed for a project. The more efficient and certain the city review process can be, these elements can be removed from the cost of capital. Another related tool that cities have is allowing flexibility with respect to the timing of payments for large fees. We have talked about project financing generally. However, often there are components of the financing only available following the completion of specific milestones. Most cities collect most fees prior to the issuance of construction permits. However, oftentimes this exceeds the financing available at that point in the project process. Cities can provide assistance to a developer by deferring certain fee payments until construction is completed, a milestone that often facilitates receipt of further funding. Before we talk about how the city can support financially assisted housing production, let's define what financially assisted housing is. Financially assisted housing is housing where the cost is subsidized, so the owner or renter pays a below market rate that is affordable based on median income and household size. Generally, the funding for these subsidies is geared towards households earning 80% or less of area median income. The term affordable housing is typically used to describe financially assisted housing. However, as we have learned, the term actually describes a much broader segment of the housing market. There are developers who focus specifically on the financially assisted housing market and construct projects with financial assistance geared towards the construction of affordable housing. The list of these financial assistance sources is evolving. Some opportunities were eliminated with the dissolution of redevelopment agencies, while other funding sources continue to emerge. Funding sources come in many forms and typically fall into one of 3 categories: equity investments, such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, grants, or loans. Many times, a developer will utilize multiple funding sources for one project. Oftentimes, the funding is competitive. The city can play a role in facilitating applications, which can include anything from providing a letter of support to meeting certain project approval milestones within a specified time frame. The city can also establish regulations which directly increase the construction of financially assisted housing. Inclusionary zoning is where a certain percentage of a market rate residential project's units are required to be affordable and integrated into the development. An in-lieu fee program allows an inclusionary zoning requirement to be satisfied through a fee payment rather than unit construction. These fees could fund a city grant or loan program to provide a financing option that could be utilized by an affordable housing project. Lastly, incentive zoning provides development incentives in exchange for the production of financially assisted units within a project. We will explore these concepts in more detail in Speaker Series number 3. We hope this presentation has provided you with a better understanding of the economics of the housing market and the role the city can play. Thank you for listening.